Hey Cottonwood family, again this is Beau Landers, one of the discipleship and teaching pastors, and as we now are in part 2 of our series of how to read the Bible, we're now going to ask the question, well then how do we begin reading? And so the next several will be asking this question. And for this first one, we're going to look at how to read the Bible and then looking at how do we understand context, or what is context within the Scriptures. Anytime you come to a passage, what we have to realize is that that individual verse or those verses are in a broader context. Specifically 3 different kinds of context. There's literary context, which is what's happening around the passage, as well as genres that we're going to talk about later. Then there's also historical context. From a historical standpoint, what's happening in Israel's history if you're in the Old Testament, what's happening in the history of the world if you're talking about who Paul is ministering to. And then you also have theological context. And so those 3 contexts begin to work together to develop and make the meaning for the text. And so as we think of context, think of it this way. If I say the word hand, what does the word hand mean? Now that might be a silly question. You're like, well, you just held one up. Well, that is your hand. Well, okay, what if I say it like this? Okay, give her a hand. Now that could mean like a helping hand, but what could that also mean? That could mean like a round of applause, like give her a hand. It could also mean throw her a hand. That might be more in the realm of helping. You could say hands on a clock. Well, that would mean something very different. And so we see that even just in a simple word like the word hand, based on the context that that word is in, determines the meaning for that individual word. Well, when we come to Scripture, it's actually no different. When we come to Scripture, we have to begin to understand the context of not just the individual words, but the individual verses, then all of a sudden the passages, and we have to see all of the context that is happening so it can determine the meaning for the text. When you come to a passage, the best realization you have to have is that the passage, first and foremost, was written to a particular people in a particular place. And so we call this beginning to bridge the gap, bridge the context. And so we have them is what are represented by these people who the verse was originally written to. Now, what we want to do is we want to read a verse and we want to say, well, how does that apply to me? How does that apply to me? How does that apply to me? But first we actually have to understand it in their original context. And so to understand the them, and then to understand where we are, some 2,000 plus years removed from it, those are 2 very different contexts. And so there's a gap between them, those original hearers of the word, and us, these now 21st century believers. And so all that happens in between are things that we have to take into consideration, cultural things, history things. We have to look at all of this stuff so that when we're reading the passage, we understand it first with them, then we can bridge the gap and then bring it to us. And so over the next few videos, what we're going to do is we're going to continue to ask the question, how do we read the Bible? And we're going to look at those 3 contexts. We're going to break down those contexts, and we'll actually use some individual passages for each to just show you some examples. So I hope you can keep continuing to tune in.